Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression in the United States, and more specifically, the effects that it has on Black America. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The Great Depression, hopefully you remember from United States history, was a disaster. It was an absolute collapse for the United States, of the economy for the United States. It's going to take a toll all over the country, specifically, again, in economic statistics and things of that nature affecting people. So there's a few of those statistics that I think directly show how disastrous and how terrible this collapse was. So from 1929 to 1932, national income is going to be cut in half, from about $81 billion annually in income to down to $40 billion annually. Americans are going to make less money, and they're going to buy fewer goods, which worsens the situation. Obviously, businesses are not able to support themselves and not able to maintain what they're doing in their businesses if they do not have clients that can spend money. Unemployment is going to quadruple all the way up to 25%. Everyone in this in the country at the time is going to be affected, whether rich or poor, and that's because the effects were somewhat indiscriminate in who they attacked, who they belonged to. And so we see all over the country, regardless of social status, we're going to see an effect of the Great Depression. However, the times are going to be more difficult for Black Americans. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, most Black Americans are going to remain in the rural South. And in the rural South, they're mostly still farmers and still sharecroppers. And they're growing cash crops like cotton. And these cash crops are going to be cut to about a third of the pre-depression prices. This is going to cause, obviously, them to need less people or be able to pay for less people to work on those farms and sharecropping, which is going to disproportionately affect African Americans in the South. African Americans in the North and in the South as well that do have other jobs, manufacturing, things of that nature, they're going to be laid off, especially to make room for white Americans who need work. So if you have a white American who is having a higher level job, if they're not able to get that job, they may then go down and look for something that is more widely available, even if it makes less money, and those are often held by African Americans who would be laid off in this case. So unemployment is much higher for African Americans during this time than even the very high 25% that we see generally overall. It's different all over the country, but for instance, it was as high as 60% in some cities like Detroit. It's higher than that even in southern cities, sometimes approaching 80% in some southern cities. Black businesses were able to grow prior to this. We start to see black businesses being built, especially as segregation is taking hold. There need to be black businesses for African Americans to participate in and to have. And so many African Americans have built successful medical and law practices, as well as businesses, stores, insurance companies, things of that nature. And they are hit hard by the Depression. Many hospitals that have been set up solely for black clientele, including black doctors and black nurses, are going to close, forcing African Americans to go back to the segregated hospitals that existed. Insurance companies that were selling selling policies to African Americans are not going to be able to make it very well, neither are banks. Now, some of these companies do succeed, and some of the most successful companies are going to be insurance companies, black insurance companies during this time. But it's not really all bad news. So there is some good that comes out of this time, not necessarily because of this time, but it just so happens to be going on at the same time. And that includes protests during the Depression. So we're going to talk about several different aspects of protests that African Americans are doing during the Depression. So a lot of this is going to be the work of the NAACP, and we'll start with them and their civil rights. So the NAACP was able to become more effective during this time, largely due to the shift in black populations from the South to the North. Some of the things that this new generation of African Americans are able to do without some of the oppressive things that are going on in the South. The NAACP was able to become a more effective, led by Walter White, They are going to investigate lynchings. Walter White is going to investigate more than 40 of these himself, and 8 race riots. And they are going to also lobby for civil rights. Is also going to successfully oppose the appointment of John J. Parker, who had been an outspoken white supremacist and had been appointed by Hoover to the Supreme Court. To really think about what's happening throughout the country, Hoover needs more and more support, especially from Republicans. He himself being a Republican in the South. Now, this is not the Republican Party that we know of today. The Republican Party had traditionally been the party of Lincoln, the party that ended slavery and things of that nature. And so Hoover is going to need their support, especially in the South. And so he is attempting to win that by appointing someone that kind of went along with some of their views. And in this case, he does that. But the NAACP issues and completes a very successful campaign and prevents Parker's nomination to the Supreme Court. Then we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who we've talked about in the past, who is partially critical to the NAACP's handling of economic issues because they are focusing on these legal challenges that we're going to talk about, and he doesn't feel that they're talking enough about economic issues. So he calls for the creation of a black economic nation within a nation, meaning that African Americans would create their own businesses, they would support their own businesses, and that they would essentially live separate from the United States economically, building essentially their own economy. People didn't necessarily disagree with that, but they did sometimes attack him, especially black intellectuals attacked him for advocating voluntary segregation. And Du Bois said that he wasn't really advocating segregation, but as long as segregation did exist, that the NAACP should focus on creating black institutions and improve the quality of segregated institutions. However, this opposition is going to be a bit of a scandal for him, and it's going to end up removing him from the NAACP, which of course he was one of the founding members of. You then have education battles. So the NAACP is going to hire former Vice Dean of Howard University Law. He had gone to Harvard and then was running this program at Howard University Law, which was responsible for producing a lot of African American lawyers. This is Charles Hamilton Houston, who laid out a plan for legal program to challenge inequality in education and voting. They wanted to challenge this because we're seeing, despite the fact that the Supreme Court said that separate could be also equal, we weren't seeing separate and equal facilities in education throughout the country. And so, for instance, in Georgia, the average annual expenditure, so the money spent on a white student in Georgia per year, was $36.29. On a black student, it was only $4.59. This also included the incredibly lower wages for African American teachers as opposed to white teachers. So obviously, these things are not equal. The pay is not equal. The facilities are not equal, and so they were challenging the law on that standing. Houston, who we just talked about, is going to convince Walter White to hire his former student Thurgood Marshall, and that name should be familiar to you, and if not, it will become increasingly familiar to you. The two men are going to work together on a network of African American attorneys to end discrimination against black students in professional and graduate schools. The first significant victory is going to be in Gaines v. Canada, in which they're essentially going to argue that an African American should be given the right to set up or go to a law school in Missouri. They're going to win this case. It's really the first significant victory that they're going to win, and a law school is set up for African Americans. It's still there today in Jefferson City, Missouri. So there's a lot about that case. You're more than welcome to look into it. Gaines did not actually survive. He was the complainant, I guess, in that case, and he disappeared during that case. So there's a lot to that case, but nonetheless, it is the first victory of these for the NAACP. Then we can look down to Texas, where Texas had passed a white primary law, and this law prohibited black involvement in Democratic primary elections in Texas. Now, in Texas, as in most of the South, the vast majority of races are Democratic. So the real race is between who would be the Democratic nominee. It was essentially a shoo-in that the Democrat would beat the Republican. So if you kept black people out of the Democratic primary, then you kept black people out of voting, which, although was practiced all over the South with voter suppression and things of that nature, it was illegal to outright prohibit black people from voting in the South. And so this was their way of doing it, by saying that only white people could participate in the primary. So the Texas branches of the NAACP are going to start the longest sustained effort to challenge laws such as these that we see in the history of the NAACP. It started in 1920, and it wasn't until 1944 in Smith v. Albright that the Supreme Court is going to rule finally that the white primary was unconstitutional. So that is a victory that we see. And then we also see black women community organizers such as Daisy Adams Lampkin, Juanita Mitchell, and Ella Baker, who all worked with the NAACP to create organizations. They raised funds, they recruited young people, they created newspapers, and they supported black-owned businesses. These women alone, Ella Baker, one of the leading civil rights activists of the 50s and 60s, started in this effort. But all of these women did amazing things to help the efforts of black people during the Depression. And so, again, I encourage you to look more there. There's more than we can mention on in just his presentation. So let's talk about African Americans and the New Deal. So hopefully, again, we remember the New Deal. President Roosevelt is ushering through a large amount of legislation in his first 100 days, more than any other president by far, to that time and still today, in office. And these were all aimed at combating the issues caused by the Great Depression. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is just an example. There are tons, but this is just an example, which is going to help African Americans by pumping billions of dollars into an industry in which, again, 4.5 million black people work. So, and that is farming. Essentially, it's going to give subsidies. It's going to give government payouts to farmers all over the country, rural workers, rural farmers, in order to produce less. So that, therefore, if you produce less, the prices will go down. It's ruled unconstitutional at a later date. However, before that, it is helping people, and it's used as a good example because the way programs like this were set up is that, yes, they were giving people money, but they're creating smaller committees throughout the country that decide how they get the money. So let's say in Knoxville, you're going to have a committee, the Agricultural Adjustment Committee, which is going to receive a certain amount of money and then determine how everyone within the region receives that money. Well, again, because of what the South was at the time, those people put in charge of it were also racist, I suppose, and not allowing any money to flow into the hands of African Americans. And so, whereas, again, African Americans are in the industry and they're benefiting indirectly from it, they largely do not see direct payments from programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So, again, it helps African Americans in a great way. However, it does not help them as significantly as it does white Americans because of the racist setup of politics in the South, which we'll continue to talk about. So as white liberals start to begin to recognize the electoral potential of black people, they recognize that black people would start being able to vote, especially as they're moving to the north and they're getting out of some of these voter suppression laws that you see all across the South, they begin to advocate for the inclusion of black officials in the government. And one of the earliest allies in this particular fight was the First Lady of the United States, was the wife of the current president at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, who would convince her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, to the president, to appoint someone to make sure that African Americans would receive fair treatment. And Roosevelt does do this. I don't want to say it was begrudgingly. Roosevelt recognized this political power. It was not his priority. Civil rights was not his priority. Just plain and simple was not. He respected his wife. He respected her opinion. He did as she asked. He worried a little bit about losing the racist Southern Democratic part of his party. And so he worried about doing too much. He thought about doing a little bit more. But Eleanor Roosevelt, for sure, can be counted as an ally for the African American community. And the Roosevelt administration is going to continue to employ many black professionals from different fields. You've got engineers, you've got doctors, you've got scientists, so on and so forth. And they're going to pull together a core group of highly placed, and by that I mean in high positions of power and organizations and things of that nature, highly placed African Americans who are social scientists, who are going to be linked in a network called the Federal Council on Negro Affairs, which is also known as the Black Cabinet. And the Black Cabinet is going to become sort of a symbol for the connection to the black community that Roosevelt was establishing. And it's going to start the beginning of a rise of African American politicians and officials in the country. One of those is the leader of the Black Cabinet, Mary McLeod Bethune. If you know much about historical black colleges and universities, she is the founder of Bethune-Cookman in Florida. She is the leader of the Black Cabinet. She's considered the first lady of the struggle by many. And she was an educator who believed in the power of education to promote social equality. She believed that through education, potentially African Americans could rise to these positions of power. And she does that and becomes one of the leading voices for black people during the Great Depression and within the Roosevelt administration. So by 1935, much of the original New Deal that we talked about was falling apart, or it had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In response to this, Roosevelt is going to push for a second burst of legislation, including Social Security, which of course is the biggest program, the most well-known program still around today of the time, and arguably one of the most important for African Americans in general, if not everyone in general. It is a leftward push. He's going to start leaning left, politically left, and it's going to help him win re-election. However, it's also going to create a new coalition of liberal-leaning Democrats. You've got the Republicans that are kind of already on that side. It is going to leave out the Southern Democrats, which is going to create a whole new group of Democrats who are solely focused on maintaining segregation in the South. We call those the Dixiecrats. That's separate. We'll talk about that all later. But it's going to create this new coalition, including for the first time since the turn of the century, which again we'll talk about at another point, the trajectory of black political power. It's going to see the return of African Americans to political power. They're going to be important again, and we're going to start seeing this shift. It's not entire. A lot of African Americans still support the Republican Party because of Lincoln and slavery and a lot of the other things they did after the Civil War. A lot of African Americans are not involved in politics at all. Some that are in sort of your fringe organizations. Again, we'll talk about that. But they are definitely going to start to see this return to political power, and they're going to find some of that power in the Democratic Party during this time. And this is all under the second New Deal. So, the Great Depression is going to hit African Americans harder than the rest of America. It is also, however, going to reveal the beginnings of new activism, which is going to lead to an end to segregation in the 1950s and to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. They're going to find an ally in the White House in Eleanor Roosevelt, and to a degree, in small part, in Franklin Roosevelt, but mostly in Eleanor Roosevelt. And they're going to start to see the roots of political power for blacks, which is going to return African Americans to positions of power, elected positions of power throughout the country, which is going to increase in various ways, in very slow various ways, throughout the entire country. So the Great Depression is significant for African Americans in addition to the significance it holds for all of American history. And hopefully you will be able to recognize some of the traits of the Great Depression that changed the way African Americans lived. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.